Happy Thursday. It is Therapy Thursday. How are you tonight? I am Dr. Triffy. I'm a licensed psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia. I am also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia, and I'm an advanced clinical hypnotherapist. I train clinicians and mental health professionals to use hypnotherapy as an adjunct to counseling and therapy in their practices. So every Thursday, about this time, I show up on this Transforming Trauma podcast to offer tips and strategies, thoughts, ideas to help us think better, feel better, and do better. I have been doing a lot of work of late on grief and surviving grief, recovering from grief. I chose to do that as a way to help myself move through a very painful grief recovery experience. And as I started doing that, I realized how much pain so many of us are in. I think when you think about it, you realize that in addition to regular life, where we lose people, we lose jobs, we lose homes, we lose things that are valuable to us, we are coming out of a pandemic. And so many of us have lost so many people. And recovering is not for the faint of heart. Recovering from grief is not for the faint of heart. I think that grieving, nobody has to teach you how to grieve. Nobody has to help you feel the pain you feel when you lose someone or something that's very valuable to you. But sometimes we need help recovering from grief. So tonight, I want to ask the question though, can you grieve too much? Can you grieve too much? And what might you want to be looking at to gauge yourself to see, okay, I think I'm kind of moving along on a sort of typical journey of recovering, or this might be taking a bit of a sidetrack for me. There are several ways and several experiences of grief that are not typical. And I want to talk about at least one of them tonight. I want to talk about at least one of them tonight. So I'm going to share my screen with you in just a second because I want to add a little piece of what I'm doing soon. So, as a trauma informed therapist, as a trauma recovery specialist, I have found that it is one of the tasks of recovery to find the gem, find the lesson in the pain, find a gift in the pain to help us as human beings move away from the absolute pit of the abyss. I call it the abyss, to help us start coming up towards recovery. And so one of the things I've chosen to do with my recovery process is to turn that into offering information, sharing my experience. So this year in May, first week of May, I am presenting at the Licensed Professional Counselor Association of Georgia's annual conference. And this year we're meeting in Savannah, Georgia. You all know Savannah is a really lovely town in Georgia. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. And I will be sharing some of my perspective as what we refer to as a wounded healer. So typically, you have a person like me, a therapist, who you're the one that's sitting in the chair and people come to you and they pour their hearts out to you. And now life has put you in the position where you have to be the one, you're in the client's position, really, you're in the client's role. So how do therapists help clients when they themselves are going through or are experiencing their own life situations. I'm going to be talking about that. And I'm also going to be sharing some of my top, I think they're innovative strategies to help people recover from grief. So, move with me here. So, you all know me, right? I'm Dr. Triffy. I am from Dominica. You hear a little bit of an accent in my voice. I'm from Dominica. And before you say you know where Dominica is, we are between Guadeloupe and Martinique. We are not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, okay? I'm an author as well as a clinician and psychologist. I have written a book called Do It Now that's available on Amazon. Just click Do It Now, Dr. Wallace or Triffy Margaret Wallace. You'll find it. I also show up to do the Transforming Trauma podcast on Thursday evenings. I created in the middle of the pandemic a Facebook group for women called Trauma Transformers Tribe. And the intention of that group was to come together to help us sort of move along in the early, uncertain, scary days of COVID. And the group has grown from 8 to about 200 and something women right now from all over the world. Again, my intention when I show up on a Thursday night in my role as a psychologist is to help you, the listener, gain skills to think better, feel better, and hopefully do better. All right. So, what is grief? If you're alive, if you've lived long enough, you will understand what grief is. So, the Oxford Dictionary describes grief as deep sorrow, especially sorrow that is as a result of death, losing someone. Now, you also know that you don't have to just have lost someone to experience grief, not just through death. Many of us experience grief as a result of separation, divorce, relationship breakups. We become maybe physically disabled. The work we used to be able to do, we can no longer do it. We have to retire, or again, you might get diagnosed with an illness that just debilitates you and you have to mourn. You do experience a letting go, a leaving behind that is, for some people, just as painful as losing someone to death. Most of this presentation, though, is centered around losing someone after death, right? Through death. In my experience, grief is excruciating. So I've begun writing about my internal experience with grief. The word for me is excruciating. It's a just a ball, just a tangled ball of emotions. And it's not just painful emotions. I found this picture right here online where somebody actually drew what was making sense to me as far as what I was experiencing last year. Just I'm from Dominica, like I said, and I often use Dominica words. In Dominica, we, in addition to Creole, to English language, we speak a Creole, which is French based, but made up of African words. There's some Spanish words, and I think maybe some additional European root languages in there as well. But the way that ball is written, like a kid would drool, we call that macaque, which is just like absolute just chaos and nonsense. Yeah. But that was for me what my internal experience felt like, at least for a good 90 days, I'd say maybe 6 months after losing my fiance in December of 2021, very suddenly. He was not ill and very suddenly passed. Okay. So the word I would use, as far as if you had to use one word for the emotional experience, is excruciating, excruciating, whatever. Yeah. Meaning every possible emotion you can think of, negative as well as positive, because while you're feeling the sadness, while you're experiencing the sadness and the loneliness and the anxiety, wondering what is your life going to be like now? Who are you now? You're also in shock, and you're also feeling asking all of these spiritual questions. What is life about? Why is this happening? Why are we here? You know? And I know that psychologists, we have tried to explain grief, but I think from everything I read, we're still struggling, I think, to come up with a core uh, understanding of what grief is, like a core theory of what grief is. There are a couple models out there of what grief is. And one of those, many of us are very familiar with this model right here. I use the acronym DABDA, DABDA, to help me remember it. One of my little test taking mnemonic devices is what it's called. So DABDA, this process right here explains the stages of the grieving process. Typical, right? A typical, normal grief recovery process. And this was put forward by Kubler-Ross. And they talk about denial as your first, the shock, and the sense of like, no, this is not happening. This cannot be real. Turning into anger as it starts to feel more real. Anger and just supreme irritation. Then they say some of us move to a phase of bargaining, like just wishing that if I could just redo things, what if I had done just this instead? Was it something I said? Was it something I didn't say? What if I had just one change of behavior? Have you ever heard of the butterfly effect? My daughter, she mourned her dad passing, and her dad passed in 2021 as well. She kept talking about the butterfly effect, where she would say, well, Mom, I wonder if I had done one thing different, would that have changed the circumstances of dad's life? So we go through these mental acrobatics, trying to make sense out of the loss. And then you go into a state of depression, according to that model of grief, before you can come to acceptance. So essentially, recovering from the loss is about figuring out how to reorganize your life that has changed, that is always going to be different now. David Kessler did some work with Kubler-Ross. He added this stage of grief recovery that he calls finding meaning. And so he calls it the sixth stage of grief. I love that because I agree with that. That's what I meant earlier when I said I think a big task of recovery from trauma, from loss, is about finding at least one thing, one way to create meaning out of the experience for you. And that's an individual process. So, normal grieving is said to sort of follow that pattern. Of course, it's not like exactly as, as they stated, people go in and out of these stages. It's not a predictable, yes, denial, then anger, then bargaining. Like I said earlier, I, I felt all of these feelings and had all of these experiences really simultaneously on many occasions. It just felt like it was a big ball of emotions. Recovery for many people typically lasts, or it'll take from about 6 months to about 2 years. That's according to the American Psychological Association. But, again, what we want to remember is that the recovery process is unique and individual. And it's based on many different factors. So that's what I meant also when I said that psychologists are still really trying to come up with a theory of understanding grief that say you can generalize, because up to this point, I mean, who can generalize the grieving experience, right? So here are some factors to consider when we're thinking about how we move through the grieving process. What determines whether or not you might get stuck in your recovery process? Because remember, nobody needs help to grieve. We need help to recover. So, what might impact whether or not you have a 6 month recovery process, a 2 year, a 15-year recovery process, which is also possible, a lifetime where you're struggling still with chronically being just unable to release the deep pain that you felt at the onset of the loss. Personality, yeah, your personality, your attachment style. Some of us who maybe were insecurely attached, um, or we were ambivalent in our relationship with the person. Ambivalent, we were not very clear. Say you lose a dad who your relationship was complicated, and maybe you just were able to heal that relationship, or maybe you did not get the opportunity to heal that relationship before the person passed. That could complicate your recovery process because it's hard. You know, many of us speak about wanting closure. So it's harder, it's more challenging to close a relationship like that if you experienced it as unfinished, wide open, still complicated. You might still be mad at them. They died and they were mad at you. The last thing they said to you was, I hate you, stuff like that. Also, you have to consider our individual unique vulnerabilities. If you're talking about, say, a child, we're talking about a child who loses their mother, that might be a completely different experience when it comes to recovery than for a 59-year-old who loses their mother. It's very different. You're not as dependent on that parent. That person is not your everything. You have a separate life by then. You also have to consider factors like spirituality. Some of us are more connected spiritually, and we might have more support systems grounded in our spirituality. So that might be a big support to help us move through grieving and recovering. Some people, if you think about the spirituality point, some of us have many questions about life and death and what happens after death. So some of us can struggle a lot with that. Culture also has some impact on recovery. I think a big one in here is supports and resources, because I have found supports and resources to be super important for me. Super important for me as far as helping me move through the grief recovery process. Also, the nature of the relationship. What kind of relationship, did you have with the person that you lost? And then the type of loss. Was it a sudden loss that you were not preparing for? That's going to lean into traumatic grief and potentially complicate the grieving process if you're not able to access supports, versus an anticipated experience of grief, which is anticipatory grief. Say you might have had 6 months, 2 years to get used to the idea that your loved one is declining, 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 and that they are making their way out. So these are the four questions I want you to grapple with if you're on a grief recovery journey to see if you might be stuck. Yeah, there's a model in addition to the DABDA formula acronym I just gave you. There's another model of recovery. The acronym is TEAR, like Tudeshiwe, tear, T-E-A-R. The T stands for the ability to accept the reality of the loss. So, I've lost someone. One of my tasks of recovery, one of my jobs, one of my responsibilities in my healing journey, one of them is going to be to find ways to accept the reality of the loss. Some of us struggle with that a lot. So I want to ask you to assess yourself, do a bit of an internal check and see where are you on that. Say on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 meaning yes, I think I'm okay, but 10, I'm still struggling out of this world. Where are you on that? Where are you? Are you able to accept the reality of the loss? E, have you been able to experience, to feel the pain of the loss? That one, I think, can be challenging for a lot of us, especially those of us who think it's weak, maybe, to show emotions, it's weak to feel pain, or we've learned ways of coping where we repress our emotions. So some people will completely put a lid on the pain and go, as a therapist, I'll say they'll go straight to their head and bypass their heart and just kind of cut themselves off. Separate. I have to keep going. The person is gone. They're dead. I'm not feeling this. Sometimes what we do with that, what happens is later on, we have an atypical now, delayed grief response. A delayed grief response, and something maybe minor, something maybe unrelated could have you on the floor, unable to figure out why you can't stop crying. And so, one of the tasks of recovering is to allow your body, your mind, your spirit, your soul, everything about you to experience the pain of the loss. Because I think that also helps to tap into the first letter, the T, where you've got to accept that this is the reality. This is the reality. This is what we're doing on the earth, essentially. The A is sort of coming back into life, adjusting to a new life, because it is a new life, adjusting to a new life without the person. And again, depending on the nature of the relationship, that can feel very daunting. And the sense of being off balance that happens when you lose somebody so close to you that you are, say, you are married to, your lives are so connected, a child. By the way, the research continues to show that losing a child might be the most intense loss, grief, sort of pain level, intensity wise experience. But losing a spouse is right up there. Losing a parent is right up there. And so, because these people are so important to our lives, it's like that sucking out of that big force of life, big force of energy from your life. It's very destabilizing. And so, it takes time, but it is crucial to adjust to this new life without the person. So, do you see how all of that, though, is process? It's process. It's not decision. It's not decision, because grief doesn't work that way. Grief and recovery doesn't just work with, well, I'm going to stop thinking about this person that I just lost. I'm going to stop thinking about my child who just passed away. Yeah. So this is time, process, and a lot of support a lot of interventions, a lot of on purpose doing things, creating new experiences right here, which is the R, where you have to consciously now make a decision to reinvest in that new reality without your person that you've lost in the physical form, because we understand that you continue with the relationship on different levels, because our memories don't fade, do they? Hmm? Our memories do not fade, and so we carry the people that we love with us. So to review, grief recovery is a process, and it's gradual healing. It's gradual healing. You want to cut yourself some slack. You want to give yourself permission to feel vulnerable, to feel quote unquote weak, to feel exhausted, to feel tired, to not feel like working like you normally used to work. Hmm? Because this is a process of gradually healing the way you would heal a physical wound. Hmm? And then while you're healing and on top of healing, rebuilding. Hmm? Healing takes a lot of energy, doesn't it? A lot of input, a lot of support. How about building? Same thing, a lot of energy. And that is when you can start saying to yourself, okay, I've done the T part. I've I can accept the reality of the loss. You've done the E part. I felt the pain of it, and I might still be feeling the pain of it. But again, as we recover, the pain decreases in severity, intensity, the rumination decreases. You can wake up now, and your first thought is not of the person that you lost. And then you begin to do things, you begin to practice adjusting to the new life without the person. And not just that, actively putting yourself into reinvesting into that new reality. So, by that, I mean something like, well, what are you going to do with this new life? Mm. What am I going to do with this new life without my husband, without my wife, without my child, for whom I had all of these dreams and hopes and visions? What am I going to do without this husband or wife that divorced me? How will I rebuild my life? So, my question and my encouragement for you tonight is to do an assessment, do an internal kind of check to see where are you along that journey. And again, you can do a little bit of a rating where you can say, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0, I think I'm pretty good. And 10, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. No, I can't even deal with that piece yet. Reinvesting, I can't even begin to imagine my life without them. I'm still there in that place. That means you have more work to do because it does take effort and energy, and you need more supports, you need more inputs, uh, energy inputs. I have talked on here a lot about one of the big, what I found to be one of the huge inputs, rushes of energy into my life. And of course, remember that grief and recovery, those are individual processes. So we have to do the work to figure out what is working for us. Test it and see what makes me feel better. And for how long is this making me feel better? So I'm going to go into my top 5 from travel therapy, because I found travel therapy to be, for me, perhaps the biggest shot in the arm, in the heart. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that at the conference. But for me, I believe one of the reasons that travel does that is because it combines a lot of other strategies. So, a big strategy is behavioral activation, right? Behavioral activation is powerful for a person who's very sad, very depressed, or very anxious, or feeling stuck. That's where you make yourself get up and go. You give yourself tasks to do that are meaningful and very pleasurable for you. Hmm? Because your physical body, in response to grief, does not like moving, does not like moving for many people. Let me say that. In my experience, yeah, some people can do the opposite where they become a little frenetic in their energy, where they're just moving, 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 but not in a focused, kind of concentrated kind of way. So, travel therapy forces you to get up and go and do something, but it also adds the pleasure factor. It also adds the exposure to new stimuli. So, you have to learn to live without your person. For me, my person and I loved to travel. And I promise y'all, the first 4 weeks, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I don't know if I'll ever get on a plane again because I felt so. I was going to say the word is desolate, like alone. I said, how am I going to do this? You know, you're a woman, you're going to go travel alone. Who's going to open the car door for you? Who's going to carry the luggage? Who's going to pay the bills? So, you know, when you think about that tier model, the TEAR, you one of the tasks of recovery is to reinvest in life and to adjust to life without your person. And so if you can remember that, then you know you have to make yourself do it. You know, you've got to make yourself do it. Okay. So last week I returned from New York, and I wasn't intending on stopping in DC, but I did on my way down. And I want to share with you my top five, as I like to do when I go on these travel ventures. Okay, so I'm going to say these five in no particular order, because all of them are very important. All of them they felt very important to me. So, number one on my top five, New York feels like home, like my second home. You know, Atlanta is home now, but I feel very comfortable in New York. I worked in New York and have many relatives in New York and friends. And so that's where I go to when I want to feel, when I don't want to cook. You know that feeling where you don't have to cook because somebody loves you and they'll cook for you? That's New York for me. So it's family time. And in this instance, it gave me the opportunity to offer social support. You all know, those of you who followed me, to my niece who just lost her dad, and gave me the additional gift of hanging out with my nephews, who many of you, I'm sure, can relate to being the only auntie or uncle in the space, right? Remember when you were little and your auntie or your uncle came home from overseas and they brought you gifts, or they spent time with you and they played with you? I was so happy to be the auntie. So that was very, very, very sweet. All right, that's my number one so far, right? Number two. Number two is having lived in New York, taking the opportunity to see it as a tourist. And I'm saying that to all of the people who live in New York, who say are from Dominica or the Caribbean. And many of you, I know what you'll do, because that's what a lot of us do. We work a lot. You know, we work one job, two jobs. We don't like to waste time. So sometimes we can get super focused on working and making money and not necessarily enjoying the city. But it occurred to me while I was down in the financial district that New York, if you think about how Rome was back in the day, New York really is like, you're practically in the center of Earth planet. You're practically in the center of Earth planet. Think of all the deals and the money that's, you know, switching hands and being made and created in New York. That's what I found myself thinking about. And having the opportunity, not having, taking the opportunity to ride the big bus around the city as opposed to driving, as opposed to walking, only walking. I think if you're in New York, consider it. Very reasonable. What, $54? Yes. $54? Yes. Do it. All right. My number three. My number three was that Amtrak ride. And here's why. I've never taken an Amtrak ride. You do the MARTA, you do the trains in the city, but a long ride like that, um, as for me, as I'm moving through recovering from grief, these long journeys, it's like they're squeezing things out. It was a very interesting experience being and happy, alone and happy and comfortable and curious and at ease, at peace. The long ride um, gave a lot of opportunity to think and be comfortable alone. So that's one positive I think I take from the Amtrak ride, having been so long. It was 18 hours altogether. Um, so I think you should consider it if you haven't done a long train ride in the US. If you're doing it, I would say get a little roommate. I have a little joke about the roommates and the room situation. I thought I'd paid for a room. So I paid for a room. So I go in and I get into the room, and the room looks great. Huge, two beds, and I'm feeling great, you know. And then the conductor came, or one of the attendants came and said, I think you're in a roomette. I said, a roomette? What's the difference? He said, well, it's a little smaller. I was happy to go to my roommate, which was very comfortable. The food was great as well. Of course, it's prepared food, but it was very tasty to me. It was good. Good enough. All right, no, y'all, my four and my five are in DC. I've been to DC before, but twice, but on short visits, and they were for conferences. When you go to a conference, you're mostly inside of a hotel. You're doing stuff. You're going from meeting to meeting, and you don't have time to really explore the city. Look, I think I want to return to DC. I don't think I had enough time to explore DC because there's so much to see and do there. There's just so much to see and do that it's almost as if you need one day per big thing. And there's so many big things. Like, you all saw me at the Capitol building, at the Mall on Washington. Um, I got to visit the Jefferson Memorial. Cherry blossoms. If you're, I was very happy to pay the price with an allergic reaction after inhaling pounds of pollen. But it was just so beautiful. And the weather was perfect when I went. Also, to getting a sense of, I guess, like power again. Like I talked about the financial district in New York and that feeling that I felt there, like you're in the center of the universe. So, that's where all the people who love making rules for us about how to live, that's where they congregate. So, there's a bit of that there. There was a bit of that there for me. And I really enjoyed that. Perhaps my most impactful, my number five, was visiting the African American Museum of History and Culture. And when you go, I say when you go, bring tissues. Yeah, when you go, bring tissues. It is hard to walk through that space, especially as a Black person, and not feel a lot of heavy emotions. But you want to do it. You want to do that. And you want to go to the Martin Luther King um, monument as well. So those were my top 5 for my travel therapy: New York and DC. New York was family, family, family. DC was just, I felt like an explorer. I felt like a Peace Corps volunteer. You know, the Peace Corps volunteers who would come down to the Caribbean and, they have their little backpack on their backs and they're in the cabrits, they're up in the rivers, they're in I felt like an adventurer, I guess. So, yes, let's see who's here with me tonight. Thank you all for joining. I will review again the tasks of grief recovery so that you know if you might get stuck. Because the thing is, you can get stuck. There are some very atypical ways of recovering from grief that can be just debilitating. Okay? So I'll review that before we end tonight. So Wednesday's here, Janice is here. How are you? Havis, good night. Next week, Thursday, y'all, at this time, Havis Badwill, is joining me to talk about money and success. Money and success. Good night, cuz. How are you? Hi, Roslyn. Good night. Facebook user says grief is the heaviest weight you will ever bear and or wear. And I agree. I have had several very intense grieving opportunities in this lifetime. And I don't have anything else to compare the intensity of the pain to. Yeah. Not labor, yeah, not a toothache, not, yeah. And it's relentless. So it, again, because the trajectory of healing is gradual and slow, and it's ever present all day, every day, for a long time before it starts to ease up. Yes, it can feel brutal. Still, though, we have to do the best we can to, again, we don't need help grieving, but we need help recovering, to ask for support, to access therapy, to access medication support. Please don't shy away from medication support, to sleep better, to eat better, to start walking, exercising, being out in the sunlight, using the people who say yes to supporting you. Yeah, saying yes. You might want to think about it as an opportunity for you to be on the receiving end. For those of us who are very focused in our personal lives and professional lives on caregiving to other people, you can get used to that feeling of, it's almost a God complex. Like, I got this. I can do it. I know what to do. Yes, you know what to do, but because of the severity of the grief experience or the intensity of it, you might not have the emotional resources to do those things. So we need support. We need people. If we get a diagnosis of terminal cancer, we need people helping us make our appointments. We need people taking us to the doctor. Yeah. Our wife leaves because she can't do the relationship anymore. We need good friends to call us and check on us and take us out to dinner. Yeah. We need support. And it's okay to take advantage of that experience of receiving care, receiving support, especially if you're one of those people who have been, if you've been the provider, the caregiver, the healer. Yeah, like I said earlier, it's like, who heals the healer when the healer is wounded? because a wounded healer is not a most efficient healer. Can they be? No. Yeah. Hi, Petra. Blessings to you too, my sister. Bonsoir. Indigenous, Sakafet. Indigenous, yes. You know, as I see Indigenous, I think about all the natural, naturopathic, homeopathic. There are many ways to support your healing, um, which is not just an emotional healing process, it's also a physical healing process when you are recovering from grief. Another thing I wish is that the culture, the society uh, afforded mourners, people who are grieving, more time to return to work. Because I think there's room for a lot of mistakes when people return to work before they're in a mental space or physical space to do their best at work. Blessings, Petra. Yes, this one right here. Grief is the heaviest weight you will ever bear. I do agree. And I think if you have not had that kind of experience, like, everybody gets their pain in life in a different way, but count yourself lucky. Count yourself lucky. Okay. So, yes, so just to review that model of grief recovery that I want you to pay attention to in your own personal experience of grief and recovering from loss is the tier model, which says your job, what you're trying, what you're going for, what you're evaluating in yourself, what you're asking your kids who are themselves perhaps moving through grief. One, you're looking to see, am I able to accept the reality of this loss? Huh? Number one. Number two, have I, did I allow myself to experience the pain of the loss? Because the mistake some of us do, and again, sometimes it's our way or style of coping, but it might be maladaptive. It might be not in our best interest, is we just shut it down. We just seal it off. But that puts us at risk of delayed grief experiences, which are not good because that shows up completely out of context later on, potentially. And then a task is to adjust to a new life without the person. This is where you come in and you have to think about, well, what do I need to do? Family support, friend support, group support. If you don't have family and relatives, I would say, look, on Facebook, there are tons of support groups that you just have to click to join. And it might be somebody in Dubai who might have a word to help pull you through on a heavy day. And then finally, to reinvest in the new reality without your person physically, but with your person spiritually, so to speak, emotionally, because the relationships do continue, even if your loved one has passed on. So thank you all very much. We will end tonight on Simone's comment. Simone says, interesting conversation as always, Dr. Triffy. So I want to wish you all happy Holy Week. Tomorrow is Good Friday for those people who observe that. If you're fasting, take care of yourself. Happy Easter. And I will see you next Thursday, same time, with Mr. Terrence Hivis Badui from Badui Financial Services. We're talking about money, money, money. Yeah. All right, y'all. Have a lovely evening. Bye.